How did you come across Bravo 20, the film?
I actually read the book first. My dad was in the army.
Mm-hmm.
He was military, he was a tank commander, etc., etc. And so any kind of Gulf War thing, I actually watched that play out on TV live at the time. I was in junior school at the time.
Yeah.
I first heard about it when I saw the book in Sainsbury's, actually.
Mm.
When I was about 14. I looked at the back and it said it was by Andy McNab. That is not his real name, actually.
No, it's
his real
Mitchell.
name is Stephen Mitchell.
Yeah,
Stephen Mitchell. And I thought, well, okay, so this is the mission that went wrong. So I would say it's a little bit dated now, and his writing style is a bit, you can tell it's a first effort, because it's kind of a bit all over the place. But there was another book called The One Who Got Away by Chris Ryan. Again, that's not his real name.
Mm.
And it tells the same story. Now, Bravo 20 was a reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines into Iraq during the start of the First Gulf War, run by the SAS. Andy McNab was the leader of the squadron behind enemy lines. They were trying to find the Scud missiles that were being launched into Israel and so on. And half of the crew got captured and interrogated and tortured by the Iraqis, similar to the way John Peters and John Nichol did. The one who got away, Chris Ryan, was the one who evaded capture and made it back to friendly lines with his intel. Andy McNab was actually captured and he was tortured, but the actual descriptions of it in the book it's difficult to read. Let's put it like that.
Like yourself, I saw this on the news, and I remember I was always been interested in war films and war books and stuff like that. So I remember this playing out on the TV, and you can tell when you watch this film back where the budget was stretched beyond stretching point, because there's a lot of stock footage and a lot of news footage and stuff, because BBC helped finance it, so they obviously just used their own stuff. But there's a lot of stock footage in this, and it takes a while to become its own thing. And even then, when they're in Iraq, it's like, I don't even know if they're outside of the UK a lot of the time. But it does do a pretty good job, I think, of recreating the camaraderie. But the most interesting part of that is that in Bravo 20, the book, there's a guy called, I can't remember what the character, no, they use his real name, it's Vince Phillips, who is portrayed as the guy that fucked it up, that gave their position away to the enemy. And Chris Ryan also includes that in his book.
Yeah.
But in the film, it isn't him, it's the other guy.
Yeah, that's right.
But what's interesting about that is that the guy in the film that's portrayed as like the weak link of the troops is actually Chris Ryan. He's whiny and moany and complaining, and a couple of guys are just like, yeah, wind it in, this is what we're here to do, we're going to get this done, we're soldiers, we're here to do a job. And he's like, what about this? We've got rubbish equipment, just shut up. And 2 or 3 times he's like having a good old whine. Then when this film, the aftermath of the film, was actually quite interesting, more so than the film, and that the two of them are like having this public spat about your book is full of lies and exaggerations, and that didn't happen, and that didn't happen, and they're both going sort of at each other a little bit. So that's quite interesting to see that the film changes the book, and part of that I think is because the Phillips family and the SAS themselves were really annoyed that they didn't change his name in the book, but they do change his name in the film. He's not called Phillips in the film, he's called Ray somebody, I think. But you're saying about McNab, Mitchell being one of the highest decorated soldiers in the Gulf War. When you start reading around this mission, you're the history buff here, so you'll probably be correcting me on stuff. But some of these screw-ups were his. His plan, if things went wrong, how we exfiltrate, was garbage, and they didn't follow it. So the British and the American air patrols are looking in completely the wrong place for them when they're trying to get out, because they haven't followed the plan. That testing the equipment is the mission leader's responsibility. So then going, the radio doesn't work. Well, you should have checked that. You're the mission leader. So Chris Ryan sort of laying into Mitchell was like really criticizing Mitchell, McNab, whatever you want to call him, criticizing his leadership. But even in his own book, there's kind of this evidence of his failures. But in the film, there is slight explanation. It's like, we can't follow our plan for exfiltration in the film. It's like given a throwaway line. We can't go that way because we stirred up the hornets in that direction. But you could have, circumvented, gone round, but they went in completely the opposite direction. So they were screwed. I mean, the stuff that the British Army in the Gulf, and in any conflict where the British Army have been involved with, is under-equipping and equipping with bad stuff is the norm through my entire life. Everything I've read and heard is like that's just blatantly true. I worked for not the MOD but a contractor for the MOD, and they change their mind every 5 minutes about what they want, and then they get a solution that doesn't really fit any of the problems that they have. So they've always been crap.
My dad might have something to say about that. He'd say, yes, you're right. His rifle was an SLE,
right,
which was based on an FN file. And he said the thing kept jamming, it was really awful to fire and so on. And he preferred his original 303 rifle. But he was told that has been retired, you're not allowed to use that anymore.
Yeah. While we're discussing your dad, I will just clarify the point, which is I am not in any way criticising our soldiers. Okay?
Yeah,
because even when we get involved in something that I think, what the hell are we doing in that? We've got no business being involved in that. You still respect anyone that goes to do that job because they are putting their life on the line. So even though I don't agree with the reason why the government sends them there, I respect the people that go.
He wouldn't take issue with you on that point. He would take issue on the fact that the equipment was bad because he would back you up on it.
Yeah.
And he would say, yes, it was. He had a Browning high power 9mm that always jammed, and he always preferred to go back to his Webley revolver. But yeah, there was actually another book by the Sergeant Major of the SAS regiment. I can't remember the guy's name.
Yeah.
And he backed up Chris Ryan completely. And he said, Andy McNab's plan was bad, it was badly executed and so on. And he backed up Chris Ryan's version of it very effectively. He said it was Chris Ryan's ingenuity that got him out of that situation.
Yeah.
It was Andy McNab's leadership that got him captured.
He said that neither Ryan or McNab mentioned in their debrief a whole ton of stuff that supposedly happened according to their books. And he says they're both full of shit, basically. A lot of it didn't happen, but you see the battle in the film Bravo 20, where they're first discovered. Is the best part of the film technically, and it looks completely convincing to a layman like myself. Your dad might find otherwise, but it looks completely convincing. And the voiceover of Sean Bean as he's explaining why they're doing the things they're doing, like even though they're massively outgunned, they take the fight to the enemy rather than retreat. That is outstanding, but there's no evidence of it ever happening. And Chris Ryan's just like, yeah, I don't remember that happening. If you put aside this as a realistic account of the mission, it is a decent low budget attempt to retell it. The bits where you go, I don't know why you've included that, because you've done it so badly because you've got no money that you shouldn't have done it at all. Like when the helicopter's going in, that whole sequence is absolute trash, just garbage. Just don't include it. You could have just as easily have them landing, helicopter taking off, and just cut that bit out because that bit is so awful.
Yeah, it just looks cheap.
Yeah, and it doesn't do anything for the characters that we haven't already seen, because the characters are set up like we see them all a snapshot, no more, in the UK. And then we see them on the base, and there's a brilliant bit where they're like debriefing and the other patrol walks past going dun 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 dun, dun. And I was just like, I think that's just amazing, like really funny, that's got a squaddy humour. Yeah. And then they talk about, you've got to do a statement for the video, and they all make a little statement, and it's like another little snapshot of them as people. So as characters, they're already set up. So we don't need this sequence of the helicopter that's so poor. Just get straight into Iraq and start doing it. It's a really strange choice, because they must have played it back and gone,
Bravo 20, the film, it opens actually with Andy McNab talking to his wife in the house, and it goes on for quite a while. And if they wanted to save money, well, then you don't need that part of it. You could have saved the money, not have that scene. Okay, yes, it establishes character, but if you're trying to tell the story of the raid itself, then you don't need that part.
Yeah, maybe. I like to get a little bit of a flavour of the people. I think it does that effectively. And McNab is the guy that we're going to follow for the most part. Yeah. But you also, I guess, as a filmmaker, you go, who's playing that role? Because they do bring something of their persona, their reputation. Sean Bean brings with him an expectation of sort of fairly rough around the edges, but still undeniable heroism.
Yes.
So
he's got that feel to it, and I'll just put it out there, it's the only film that I've ever seen that he doesn't die in. He dies in every single film that he's in, so it's nice to see him not get killed. But he was okay, but there's an actor who was in Soldier, if you remember that show, called Rob Spenloff, who played the Sergeant Major. He would have been a much better fit to play Andy McNab, because he had that kind of gravitas and that kind of presence. But as a film, on a technical level, it's low budget. You can tell they filmed it in some beach in Wales rather than actually a desert or something like that. And I actually liked the scenes with the interrogation because they were quite well done. They weren't harrowing, but you got the feel of, this is somewhere I just wouldn't ever want to be.
Yeah, it was understated compared to the book. But
compared to the book, I mean, it's still quite tame.
Yeah, it's still effective.
It does the job. The thing that it reminded me of was Who Dares Wins with Lewis Collins, where he has to do the Iranian embassy siege. Had a similar kind of feel to that. I mean, technically, Who Dares Wins is not a particularly great film. Apparently, they had help from the SAS to film that because the guys hanging off helicopters and so on. It just has that kind of feel of it's a bit of a missed opportunity. They could have done so much more with it if they just had a bit more money and a bit more time, because what we've got is it's kind of a patchwork version of it. It tells the story, but it doesn't feel very real. It just feels like what it is, a TV movie.
Yeah. When you say it tells the story, is this story worth telling? And what I mean by that is, like, have you seen Michael Ash's documentary?
I have not seen that, and I hate myself for it, but because I am, interested in that military side of things, so I need to check that out.
It's on YouTube, so you can watch it anytime you like for nothing. Now, I don't know that you could say Michael Asher is any more objective about the story he sets out to tell than Ryan or McNab were, because he's got this history of himself having embedded with a Bedouin culture and lived with them in Africa rather than Iraq. But he retraces the route of Chris Ryan. He gives up after a while. He says, this story's not worth telling, because he finds like the goat herd, the boy who's now in his 20s at the point the documentary was made to be in his 40s now. The goat herd's like, I never saw them. I didn't see them. So he didn't give the position away, which vindicates Vince Phillips to an extent. He's like, I didn't see them. It was a guy that drove the bulldozer that saw them. So in the film, the bulldozer not made a lot of, but in the actual story that they say in this documentary was that the bulldozer was being moved into the part, I don't know what's called, like a culvert where they were hiding. They went to put that in there because they knew the bad weather was coming. They wanted to protect the bulldozer from the weather. So when the bulldozer was going in there, they saw the British patrol at that point, not before. He said there was no firefight. The SAS, the guys from the local village, because they landed like 2 miles from someone's house, and the guys from that house came out with the Kalashnikov, saw the people, fired it like a warning shot, and then the SAS just left. There was no firefight. Later on, they find like the guy who owns the taxi, and he said, I drove them to the checkpoint where they got out. In the film, it's like shoots a guy at the checkpoint, shoots him in the face through the window, and then there's like a firefight there. And he says no, and he said that none of that ever happens. Now there is, I'm sure, a reluctance from the people in Iraq at that time to be like, we were shooting at the British, we wanted to kill them. This was post-Second Gulf War by this point. And of course, you don't want to make yourself look like a bunch of murdering assholes to a BBC documentary team, do you? So there's an element of, I don't know who to believe. I genuinely believe, because the SS are trained to behave in the way that they're trained to behave. Yes. The way to get out of a solution is going to be a situation is going to be a fight. To shoot first, ask questions second. So I believe that there probably is instances where the violence that they used probably wasn't justified. It wasn't necessary rather than wasn't justified, because they would have felt it was justified, which justifies it in a war situation like that. Yeah. But it wouldn't have been necessary if they'd chosen a different path. I also believe that some of what they say is true.
Yeah.
And some of what the Bedouin says is true, and some of what they say is not true. So I think the truth is somewhere between the two. But I think that because we love that Dunkirk story, and this is a Dunkirk story, we failed, and in the face of all of that failure, we performed heroics. That is a story that the British love. Heroism in the face of failure is like the thing we lap up.
They love an underdog. They love an underdog.
Yeah.
The SAS, they don't kill unless they absolutely have to, because the way that they're trained is to evade capture, and so the truth is going to be somewhere they weren't seen until that point because they were making sure they weren't seen. They would only open fire, which would draw attention to themselves if they absolutely had to. I think that's where that's coming from.
But neither the book or the film show that. If you want to be critical of their behaviour, they drive right up to that checkpoint, and the guy's coming down the line to the point where they shoot him through the car door when he's this far away. That isn't in keeping with evading capture. You drive that car down the road, and then at some point you drive off the road, and then you go on foot because you're 20 miles away at this point, not 200. You've broken the back of your journey. I agree with what you're saying, but I don't think that is portrayed in the film.
It's very gung-ho in that way, so I'll get gun out and start shooting. Whereas if you watch Who Dares Wins, when they appear at the end on the building, they do not start shooting until it's too late for the people inside to realise what's going on.
Yeah.
And that, I think, is the difference. You don't want to draw attention to yourself. That's the last thing you want to do if you're trying to evade capture. So when they drive up in the taxi, I mean, I can remember sitting there watching it, and I'm thinking they wouldn't do that. They would sneak around. They would probably use the taxi as a distraction while they escaped.
They had a long way to go. To commandeer a vehicle makes perfect sense. To use it to the sensible limit of, if we go any further than this, we're in real trouble. And that's what they do, is they take it right to the point where they're in real trouble, where trouble is 6 inches away.
Yes.
They could have stopped a mile back, or even 10. I know they were struggling with the hypothermia, but again, that though they mention that in the film, they don't really show it. The guy that gets the hypothermia is one of the three that walk again, which if you're McNab, the most decorated soldier, he's the fourth in the line, and yet he stops, and the first three are then cut off from the rest of the patrol. It's like, who's responsible for that then?
Your unit, you stick together. You don't go off on your own, and you'd only do that as a last resort. You would stick together, so you've got all your equipment. Plus, if you've got more people, you've got more strength in numbers. It was a bit Hollywood, I think.
Yeah. That first battle sequence, which I mentioned, is like the best part of the film.
Yeah.
Suffers from being Hollywood the least. The following firefights starts to get a little bit commando-y, like the Schwarzenegger films, like bang, 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 and somebody's like, hey, throwing the gun up in the air. It's like there's a little bit more of that in the second half of the film. Up to that point, it's not, I don't think it's particularly Hollywood. It's either not faithful to what they really did, or what they really did doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. And either way, that's not the way the SAS works. There's actually a book called Stormfront, and it's about an SAS radio. It's basically their version of Rorke's Drift, and it's basically 9 SAS soldiers against a whole group of people in Africa in the early 70s. And it's a very, very good book. They all get out because it describes the fact that they worked together as a unit, they stuck together as a team, rather than going off and doing their own thing. I would recommend that. It's by a guy called Roland White, who wrote Vulcan 607. I really enjoyed reading that book. Of the two, I think Chris Ryan's book's probably got more merit to it in terms of what happened.
Yeah.
But I think the book by the RSM is probably the most accurate one there is, because he's basically saying that what he did to get away would be fine and would work. What McNab was doing was wrong. He gets into the detail of why this is wrong and why this wouldn't work and so on.
There's a fourth book now. For another member of the 8-Man Patrol has written their book. I think it was about 10 years ago, because there's the sergeant major or the sergeant, I forget the rank that you said, the guy that was in charge of the SAS in the Gulf.
Yeah.
He was the third one to write a book about it.
Yeah.
But there's another book now, another member of the patrol, and tends to back up what Chris Ryan said. I think that McNab's version is probably the closest to just being utter nonsense. But it is, if you're going to make a film about it, the one to choose. I think if you make a film about Chris Ryan's, then it's a very niche market of there's a degree of heroism. The guy was stranded, alone. He walked for miles and miles and miles, and I don't think it's going to make for a particularly riveting film. What's interesting about that, given that Ryan and McNab famously have had a spat, and if you read their books, clearly there was tension before it all became public between the two of them. They both used the same fake names for the characters who survived, but they both name, using their real names, the people that died. And obviously the film doesn't do that, it changes the names of them all. No. But they clearly, either Andy McNab was his cover name, like if you're captured, your dog tag says something other than your real name.
Yes.
And this must have said McNab, because otherwise they must have sat down, the two of them, and gone, what characters are we using? What names are we using for our characters when we write this? And I don't think that they did that. I don't think they got on well enough to have done that. Yeah. What's going on behind the scenes of both the book and the film is more interesting than the actual film of Bravo 20.
Oh, yeah. But that's the same with just about anything in reality. If I remember rightly, when you come out of the SAS, you have to sign a shit to say that you're going to use a fake name or something.
Right.
And then you automatically choose it before you leave or something like that.
Right. I was thinking more along the lines you choose one when you joined. The film gets it right in that it changes everybody's name. To hide your name, but to name somebody else to portray a real human being in a negative light when they have no ability to defend themselves anymore, I think that's wrong. There must be, as much as I want to defend Vince Phillips and say that he didn't do anything wrong, there must be a degree of truth to what Ryan and McNab say, because they both say it. A degree of truth. I don't know how far it goes, but a degree of truth, because these two guys, from everything we've seen, don't get on well enough to collude. It's interesting that Ash's documentary says that Phillips wasn't the guy that gave that position away. He can't have been a terrible soldier to be in the SAS. That's just not a thing that can happen. Why have they colluded? There's so many questions that this whole story throws up that it actually is a better film. Somebody investigating the questions is a better film than the film. Everybody in it is decent. Nobody's bad. The best guy in it is the Iraqi guy with the tash and the beret. He's pretty menacing without doing much.
Yeah, he did well with the role.
One thing that really struck me in this film, was the music choices that they've made. Now, I suspect that for the generation of the soldiers, this would be the era of music that they listened to. But it's a really strange choice if you're trying to set the scene of an era, because they picked music, and I've got a list, I actually wrote it down. They've got The Clash, Phil Collins, and they've got somebody else, which is all 79, 80, 82. The one song that they picked that is about right would have been Freedom by George Michael, which I think is like 89, so that would have been about right. But they picked these songs because there's a bit in the lyrics like freedom, like when he gets home, and rock the Casbah when you're out in it. London Calling is only used because there's a couple of lines of like bombs falling or something in it. So that's why they used that song. So they picked them because there's a line in the song or something like that, not because they actually help generate a feeling of authenticity or of the era that's being portrayed. But so thinking, what was the music of the early 90s? And I think that what was the biggest things around would have been things like Kylie and Jason, which is not really music you want in your military movie. But I can't think of anything else from that era. That when was something like Killer by Adamski? That must have been around that time.
about 92, 93, that one. It would have been Everything I Do It For You by Brian Adams. Because
that would have been 91, yeah.
Things like Bon Jovi would have been more appropriate, and Living on a Prayer.
Living on a Prayer might have been a bit earlier, but the film is portraying an era of bad music in Britain, and that's why they've gone with this other stuff. Because surely somebody like Sonia would have been more of the era and probably cheaper to license than the Clash, who were probably going to be like, sure, you can use our music in your movie, but we're making bank, thank you. Maybe they would have been better off with a score than they were with licensing these tracks, because they're not doing anything to set the era. When they have a flashback, Sean Bean showing how his camaraderie with one of his colleagues, they're going through his music collection, and the guy's throwing his tapes out the window. So,
I mean, that was more sort of the music that Sean Bean had when he was a youth, because he was in 1960, I think, something like that. So he would have been about 18 or 19 when things like Rock the Casper and the Jam and all that sort of thing. So that would have been the music that he was playing in the nightclub.
It would have been in keeping, I think, for the characters to have liked the music of that era and listened to it. But it's just such a strange choice, because they paid so much money for it when the budget's being made, the film's being made on a tight budget, that it doesn't set the era of the film. What's the Captain Marvel one, where it's set in the mid-90s and they're using things like Nirvana. They don't go, oh, well, she's 30, so she'd actually be listening to stuff from the 80s. Where's her Duran Duran and the Pet Shop Boys? So I just found it really strange, really quite striking that they did that. I would like to know where this was released, whether it had a cinema release, and whether when it had a cinema release, it had different music, because the BBC don't license music. The BBC helped finance this film, but they don't license music. They pay a set fee to the British phonographic industry, which gives them access to everything. So they wouldn't have had to pay extra just to use the Clash. They could have just used it. But this film must have been shown in other markets. But that wouldn't come under the BBC umbrella, surely.
It was originally released as a 2-episode miniseries in 1999, was never shown in the cinema. That's interesting.
I wonder when it's shown. If it's shown in America, perhaps it's only shown on the BBC's channels.
But if you compare it to, say, Who Dares Wins, that's got a soundtrack of the time of the early 80s, which is very sort of electronica. I think it was done by Roy Budd, the guy who wrote Music to Get Carter. Of the two, I think Who Dares Wins is probably the more accurate film. In terms of entertainment, I think they're about equal.
This story, there's too much of a question mark hanging over it.
Area.
Yeah.
There's too much contradiction between all of the different accounts. I mean, I should imagine that at some point somebody will try and actually put the truth together by going through all the different books and then trying to work out which are the factual parts and which are the ones which just sit. You'll probably find that the truth is nowhere near as interesting.
No.
But it makes more sense. I mean, because in the book that Andy McNab wrote, he basically planned everything, tested everything, made all the decisions. I mean, okay, yeah, he was the leader of the patrol, but it makes himself come across like he's some sort of superhuman.
Yeah.
Whereas Chris Ryan's book actually makes people feel like people.
Yeah, it's not really in either of their interests to play down what they did. His books are incredibly popular with the military, I think even today, but they certainly were. Yeah. So he wants to capture that heroism that they wanted to buy into. I've only read maybe 2-3 books by him, and I know that when I said that your book was the first one was in that genre, that you were kind of like, actually that is not the genre I was going for. And no insult was implied, but he's not a great writer. He does have that Alison Fleming, Desmond Bagley, James Bond, Ian Fleming sort of energy about his stories. You're never far away from bullets flying, people getting shot. So there's all, you can easily see why people will read one and then read another and then read another. The same reason that I like the Jack Reacher books. It's a safe bet when you pick one up. Yeah, I don't think the Bravo 20 is anymore. It's a solid 6.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good place to leave it.
Thank you once again to Barry for joining me. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, like and subscribe and support Barry as well. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Prosper.
I'll get the SAS knocking my door. You've been slagging us off on the internet, mate. No!
No.
Just Andy McNab.